Hey, what's up? It's GC Kinsey, here to tackle a question I see a lot in aromantic spaces and which has confused me for years. Where exactly is the line between platonic and romantic? As someone on the aromantic spectrum, specifically demiromantic, meaning I can only feel romantic attraction towards someone I have an emotional bond with first, I've struggled quite a bit with what constitutes platonic versus romantic, because there's a lot of overlap and gray area between them. When it comes to attraction, there's a fantastic word for that gray area, or for when you're not quite sure whether your feelings are platonic or romantic, and that's alterous attraction. If we think of platonic attraction and romantic attraction like a binary, then alterous attraction would be like non-binary. But it isn't attraction I want to focus on in this video, it's action. And I think most of us in aromantic or asexual spaces are familiar with the phrase action is not attraction. There are certain actions that most people seem to think are romantic in nature, and other actions that most people seem to think are platonic, even though you can find exceptions to any of them. So what exactly is it that makes certain behaviors or gestures or even relationships romantic? What distinguishes them from platonic ones, and how can we tell the difference? When so many things can be interpreted as either platonic or romantic, where and how do we find the line? I recently saw a comment from user Maxorus on the aromantic subreddit that I thought provided a great way to think about this. And yes, this comment is a couple of years old now, but the advice it offers is timeless. Most, if not all, romantic gestures are only romantic because of the intent behind them. What a fantastic observation, right? Ever since I read this comment, I've been trying to think of any action or behavior or gesture that's inherently romantic. And I can't, because it really does all boil down to romantic intent. There are plenty of actions that are romantically coded, but just because something is romantically coded doesn't make it romantic. Let's look at some examples. Number 1. Dates. What is it that makes dinner and a movie, or a stroll through a park, or a night out dancing at a club a date? It isn't the activity itself, because you can do any or all of those things with a platonic friend or relative. It's only a date if you want it to be, if you go into it with romantic intent. And even then, you can still call something a date without it being romantic. I know I've been on plenty of friend dates that weren't romantic at all. I've also ended up in a couple of awkward situations where a guy assumed he was inviting me out on a lunch date or a coffee date, but because he didn't specify that it was a date, I just assumed it was a hangout between friends. So that's why I think it's important to express your intent when you invite someone out to do something with you. That way, everyone's on the same page and no one ends up confused. I'm a longtime Nicktoons fan, and I remember an episode of Doug where Patty Mayonnaise asked Doug to see a movie with her one night, and he spends the entire episode debating whether it's a date or not, and looking for all these little clues trying to figure it out. And at the end, when he gets home from the movie, he's still not sure. And to me, that episode is the perfect encapsulation of how impossible it is to tell whether something counts as a romantic date when no one expresses clear romantic or platonic intent. Number 2. Gifts. Certain gifts are considered romantic in nature. Flowers, chocolate, and jewelry come to mind. But giving someone one of those things as a gift doesn't have to imply that you have romantic feelings for them. I know I've given and received all of those types of gifts in both romantic and platonic ways. When it was romantic, what made the difference was the romantic intent behind it. And just like with dates, I think that's something you can express when you give a gift, either verbally or with a card or whatever works best for you. It's also worth pointing out that sometimes a gift that isn't one of those typical romantically coded ones might end up being the most romantic gift of all. If you get your romantic partner their favorite brand of tea, or supplies they need for their hobby, or that rare collector's item they've been looking for, that might be 1,000 times more romantic than flowers or chocolates or jewelry could ever be, because it's personally tailored to them and shows how much you pay attention and how much you care. Number 3. Gestures. Much like with gifts, there are certain gestures or acts of service that are romantically coded. Things like offering someone a ride home, offering to carry their books or their bag or their groceries, writing a poem or a song for them, etc. In romance, anime, and manga, a big one is bento, making your crush a cute little lunchbox and bringing it to them at school or at work. And that brings up another important point about romantically coded actions, gestures or otherwise, which is that so much of romantic coding is cultural. What one culture considers romantic versus platonic may not carry over to other cultures, which further goes to show that none of it is inherent and it all really does come down to romantic intent. Something interesting I've noticed about romantically coded gestures is that sometimes they're a simple expression of romantic feelings, but other times they're used to pressure someone into a romantic relationship. As in, I do all these little things for you, what are you gonna do for me in return? Why don't you like me back? Why are you putting me in the friend zone? And that's pretty gross, making romantic gestures transactional like that. I also think that kind of transactional approach to romantically coded gestures makes some people hesitant to offer those same gestures in a platonic way for fear of giving the wrong impression. Like if they wanted to write poetry for a friend, or carry a classmate's books, or drive a coworker home, they might not feel like they could in case it comes across as not only a romantic gesture, but also a transactional one. And that's because even without any romantic intent behind them, these gestures themselves can sometimes be interpreted as expressions of romantic intent. Which is why clear communication about your romantic intent or lack thereof is so important. Number 4. Touch. I saved touch for last because, in some ways, out of these 4 types of actions, it's the most complicated in terms of how it gets romantically coded. And I think people are more likely to argue that some forms of touch are inherently romantic compared with these other types of actions. But let's break that down and see if it's true. We'll start with a really simple one: holding hands. In general, when you see 2 people walking down the street holding hands, you assume that they're romantic partners, right? That assumption is actually what makes a lot of same-gender partners afraid to hold hands in public. But holding hands is not an inherently romantic form of touch. If it were, you wouldn't see parents holding their children's hands to keep them from getting lost, drunk groups of friends holding hands to keep each other from stumbling, nurses and other caregivers holding their patients' hands for comfort, families and friends holding hands for emotional support during weddings or funerals, and handshakes as a greeting wouldn't be a thing. Again, what makes the difference when it comes to holding hands is romantic intent. And I think cuddling is similar. Some people only cuddle in romantic ways with romantic partners. Others are perfectly comfortable cuddling in a platonic way with friends or family members. Just like holding hands, cuddling isn't inherently romantic. It depends on romantic intent. But what about kissing? That one is clearly romantic, right? That's where we definitely draw the line in the sand between romantic versus platonic forms of touch. Well, not exactly. Kissing depends on romantic intent too, and romantic intent isn't automatically built into kissing. Think about how common it is to greet someone with a kiss on the cheek in a completely platonic way. In some cultures, this is reserved more for friends and family. In others, this is done between strangers. And even kisses on the lips aren't always romantic, like when actors do it in film or on stage. Some people even kiss their friends on the lips in a platonic way. That's something you see a lot on the TV show Queer as Folk. Many of the main characters who are in one big queer friend group together tend to greet each other with kisses on the lips. And you can tell the difference between those platonic kisses versus romantic kisses that characters share with partners by, you guessed it, romantic intent. When it comes to kissing, just like there's this question of whether it's romantic versus platonic, there's a similar question of whether it's sensual versus sexual. And I think that could be its own other video, so if you want me to make it, let me know in the comments. But what I'll briefly say about that here is that kissing and other forms of sexual touch don't have to involve any feelings of romantic attraction. That's how it's possible for friends with benefits or buddies or other no-strings-attached sexual arrangements to exist between people who aren't romantic partners, and how sex work can exist as an occupation. 2 other things I want to mention about touch. The first one is cultural norms. Certain forms of touch get normalized as either romantic or platonic in very different ways across different cultures. And that depends on things like what role amatonormativity plays within a culture, or what kind of shame a culture places on public displays of affection. In some cultures, it may be considered totally normal for platonic friends to kiss, whereas in other cultures, romantic partners may rarely kiss, much less platonic friends. And cultural norms around touch may differ in public versus private spaces. So just like I mentioned before with gestures, that variety in cultural norms around touch proves that no form of touch is inherently romantic. The second one is personal boundaries. Each individual has their own idea of what constitutes platonic versus romantic touch and what kinds of touch they're willing to engage in with other people. And that's another reason why I think it's so important to talk about romantic intent, because otherwise, cultural norms can easily override personal boundaries. Also, those of us on the aromantic spectrum may have quite different boundaries around touch than our alloromantic counterparts because of our orientations. And being arospec in an amatonormative world can make it harder for us to navigate other people's romantic intention behind touch, which may affect the personal boundaries we have or the way we enforce them. I'm a largely touch-averse person, and as such, I don't have any trouble drawing my own line between what I consider platonic versus romantic touch, because platonic touch is rarely even a thing for me. And knowing that most other people out there are both more inclined to romantic attraction and more receptive to touch than I am makes me set stricter boundaries around touch than the average person. For other arospec folks who aren't touch-averse, it might be completely different. For example, if a gray aromantic person enjoys cuddling or holding hands or kissing in both a platonic and a romantic way, I can imagine the question of, wait, what kind of touch is this, might cross their mind. But yeah, like I said, touch is complicated, and that's why I spent so much of this video on it. But before I completely wrap things up, I just want to reiterate the point that nothing in this world is completely, 100% inherently romantic. For every date, every gift, every gesture, and every form of touch that's romantically coded, there's at least one exception for how it can be platonic as well. So if you're ever struggling to find the line, the best place to start is by looking for romantic intent. And with that, now is where I want to turn the conversation over to you. Have you ever had trouble telling the difference between platonic versus romantic actions? Has that ever caused any misunderstandings with people? How do you express romantic intent, or lack thereof, in your actions toward other people? If you're on the aromantic spectrum, how does amatonormativity affect all of this for you? And whether you're arospec or not, what questions do you have about all this? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I'm GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I have more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person. I've got cosplay music videos, makeup tutorials, a whole bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your support. Happy Aromantic Awareness Week. And I will see you on the next one.